We are just about to make an effort here to travel from Fair Havens to Phoenix. And you can see Fair Havens there at the very bottom, that little point at the bottom there. Remember, there's no room there for wintering, so they decided to go to Phoenix. Now, when you look at this map, you say, well, this doesn't seem like such a difficult decision to make. I mean, you're only talking 50 miles. You still have the protection of the island from the northeast winds that are blowing. And so, why is this such a huge decision? And I would agree, as a layman looking at this from where I sit, this should be a no-brainer. But as we're about to see, it's a little more complicated than at first meets the eye. And so there you see again the broader picture of the trip and all that they have already experienced on board. So the south wind blew softly. So the northeast wind has ceased for the time being, and now the winds have shifted. They're coming out of the south, and if you live in the Midwest where I live, you know how nice a soft south wind feels, especially in the colder time of the year. And so they supposed that they had obtained their desire, and they put out to sea, sailing close by Crete. Even though the south wind is blowing, they don't want to take any chances because this is a volatile time of year, and so they're hugging the shore as closely as possible without hitting the reefs, obviously, just to be sure. But not long after, a tempestuous headwind arose called Euroclydon, and that is a word that means northeasterner. It was a fearsome word. Mariners back in that day had a great deal of respect for that kind of storm. Some have said that it may be like a hurricane, and that's probably a pretty good comparison. Very strong winds. They've already experienced northeast winds, but this is the onslaught of probably something like a hurricane. And even though they are close to the shore in Crete and trying to take advantage of the shelter there, the power of the winds of this storm are too much to protect them even in that situation. So the ship is caught in this. They could not head into the wind, and so they decided to let her drive. And I'm not a sailor, I'm not a mariner, but based on what I have read, if you don't let it drive, if you don't let the ship go the way the wind wants to take it, you'll probably end up breaking the ship up or causing it to capsize. And so you simply have to let it go. And that's what they did. And running under the shelter of an island called Clauda, we secured the skiff with difficulty. Now, there's the third mention of that little phrase, with difficulty, but it's getting harder and harder and harder. Clauda is a very, very tiny little island, and you can see it here. In fact, the red dot on this map pretty much covers it up completely. Tiny, tiny little island, but they're able to secure the skiff there. Now, the skiff is the lifeboat. The lifeboat could be transported about three different ways. One would be to actually carry it on deck. And of course, that would depend on space limitations, how many people you had on board, and all that. Sometimes it was secured on hooks to the side of the ship, and other times it would be towed by cables of some sort. And that is probably the case here. The fact that they had to secure it with difficulty, under the shelter of this little island, probably indicates that it was being towed behind them. And so they had to reel it in or pull it in, or, maybe it was on a pulley, and they were able to finally get it up on to the deck of the ship. So things are looking pretty rough right now. Here's a picture of Clauda today, and this is the North Shore. Now remember, they have to take shelter on the South Shore because of the northeast wind blowing. If they had been on an island or an area like this, they could have just taken the ship right on in, probably, and found some protection. But this is what the South Shore of Clauda looks like. And as you can see, there was absolutely no possibility of finding a place to dock the ship on this side of the island. So when they had taken it on board, the skiff, the lifeboat, They used cables to undergird the ship, and fearing lest they should run aground on the Syrtis sands, they struck sail and were so driven. Now, I want to point out something that is really, really precious here in verse 17. Pay close attention to this because I find this to be extremely interesting. You notice I've highlighted the word cables here. That word is used only one other time in the New Testament. And you wouldn't expect this passage, but it's Hebrews chapter 4, verse 16. And you probably are familiar with this passage. Verse 15 says, "We do not have a high priest who cannot be touched with the feeling of our infirmities, but was in all points tempted like we are, yet without sin." And then verse 16 says, "Let us therefore come boldly to the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need." Now, a literal translation of the last part of Hebrews 4:16 is that we may find grace for well-timed help. Or to put it another way, grace in the nick of time, just exactly when we need it. And that word help, grace for well-timed help, is actually the word cables here in Acts 27:17. Now, let me give you the illustration. These cables could be made of leather or chains or ropes. Normally, I think probably the most common was probably ropes. And what they would do is send these cables on the upside of the current, and with a bobber of some sort on them, shove them under the ship, and then they would come up on the other side because of the bobber that was connected, the floating device. Then they would grab them and they'd bring them on the ship, and they'd connect the rope together with a turnbuckle and tighten it in order to literally hold the ship together. The bow of the ship, the underside of the ship was normally made with planks, and strong winds and waves could eventually loosen those and cause them to separate and eventually bring about the demise of the ship. So these cables would literally hold them tightly together so that when the winds and the waves became really dangerous, the ship would be protected. All right. And so in Hebrews chapter 4, the writer of Hebrews is telling us that we can come boldly to the throne of grace through our Lord Jesus Christ, our great high priest. And by coming, we can plead to God for mercy and grace for well-timed help. And so think of the cables here. When we come to our God in prayer, when we come to him for grace and mercy, he wraps the cables of his mercy and grace around us to keep our ships afloat and secure when the seas of life become tempestuous. And I just find that an absolutely amazing truth. So just kind of keep that in mind the next time you're teaching or talking about Hebrews chapter 4 and our great high priest. Keep in mind Acts 27 and the cables that were used to secure a ship on the high seas. So now notice that they're fearing that they might run aground. There are sandbars all over the place, especially when you get nearer to a shore, to an island or mainland. And some of these mariners were familiar with these sandbars, and one of them was well known, was called the Syrtis sands. And they're afraid that the ship might run into that sandbar, and of course, if that happens, you're done. It'll tear the ship up, and everybody will drown. And so they struck sail and were so driven. And so what you do is you allow the wind to completely control the ship. And as you do that, the wind blows the ship faster and faster and allows the ship to come up out of the water. If you've ever been on a speedboat, you know that the faster you go on the speedboat, the more the boat tends to come up out of the water until only the back end of the ship, of the boat, is actually touching the water at high speed. That's the idea here. We're going to let this thing we're going to get this ship going as fast as possible so we can get it up out of the water and hopefully miss the Syrtis sands, which they do. Yeah, there's Hebrews 4:16. In order that we may have receive mercy and that we may find grace for well-timed help, support, cables. Beautiful, beautiful reference. Well, now Luke actually does give us a little bit more accurate rendering of time here. Okay. He says on the third day. Now, the third day since when? Obviously, not the third day since they left Caesarea. Okay. He's talking about the third day of the storm when they left Fair Havens to try to get to Phoenix and got caught in the storm. That begins the clock here. So now they're at the third day, and we notice everybody's helping. Luke, the passenger, they probably allowed some prisoners, under the jurisdiction of soldiers to help. We threw the ship's tackle overboard with our own hands. So basically, what they're doing is trying to lighten the ship, and those ships would carry a lot of repair items, spare parts, even spare masts, sometimes in case the mast would break. And they're at a point now where they're saying, we got to get rid of anything that we don't absolutely have to have right now to keep us afloat and to protect us from sandbars and things like that. So they throw all of that stuff overboard using their own hands. So all hands on deck, literally here in this case. Now, when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest beat on us, all hope that we should be saved was finally given up. Now, I just want to remind you of something that we read a little while back. Do you remember when Paul was in custody in Caesarea there in the Antonia fortress after he had met with the Sanhedrin and that didn't work out and they took him back into the barracks? Do you remember that the Lord appeared to him at night and said, Paul, be of good courage, just as you've testified of me here in Jerusalem, so you will testify in Rome. So Jesus had already assured Paul that he would be testifying in Rome. And so when Luke says all hope that we should be saved was finally given up, you have to understand that this is the attitude of the majority of the people on board. Now, did Paul tell anybody that he was going to arrive in Rome safely? Had he already said that to Luke? I don't know. But this is the perspective of everybody on board, given the tempestuous storm. But after long abstinence from food, of course, you can understand why they wouldn't be eating. Seasickness and nervousness and all of that, nobody was hungry. But what happens? Paul stood in the midst of them and he said, men, and you have to imagine this, if the storm is blowing, the wind is howling, there are no microphones, okay? And so Paul has to yell at the top of his lungs even to be heard. Men, you should have listened to me and not have sailed from Crete and incurred this disaster and loss. You ever hear somebody say, I told you so? Well, that's kind of what he's saying here. And yet I don't know that he's doing it arrogantly. I think what he's trying to do is establish that he does have something to say to the people. Well, now he really has something to say. And now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. Now, at this point, any word of encouragement is welcome. They hear him say that. Nobody's going to lose their lives. Only the ship will be lost. And they may be thinking, how does Paul know that? But he goes on to explain what he means. For there stood by me this night an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve. Now, some say that this is the angel of the Lord from the Old Testament, which would actually be an appearance of the Lord Jesus Christ himself. I don't think so. Angels are commonly mentioned in Acts as servants of God carrying out responsibilities. Yes, it was Jesus that spoke to Paul back in Jerusalem, saying, you'll testify in Rome. But here, it's an angel. And this angel says to him, do not be afraid. And this is the third and final time when Paul is encouraged not to be afraid. The first time, remember, in Corinth, after Crispus and his family had converted to Christ, and the synagogue people were really upset. And then in Jerusalem, as I just mentioned, and now here on board the ship in the middle of the storm. Do not be afraid, Paul, for you must be brought before Caesar. You say, well, if Jesus already told him that back in Jerusalem, why is he repeating it? Well, why do you and I often need to be reminded again and again and again and again of the promises of God before we finally take comfort? Even though Paul had that ringing in his mind, um, the reminder from the angel on board the ship certainly brought comfort to him. So he was a human being subject to temptation and limitations just like the rest of us. All right, we're going to come back next lecture and we'll take a look at how this all pans out.